The Arizona Territory summer of 1882 brought with it a heat that seemed to press down from the heavens like a blacksmith's hammer. Elena Mackenzie had grown accustomed to the relentless sun that baked the earth around her father's ranch, turning the soil to dust and the grass to brittle stalks. At 19, she possessed the kind of quiet strength that frontier life demanded: calloused hands from milking cows, sun-weathered skin, and eyes that had learned to read the horizon for signs of trouble. Her father, Samuel Mackenzie, owned 3,000 acres of grazing land nestled between the Dragoon Mountains and the Chiricahua Range. The ranch had prospered, despite the constant threat of Apache raids and cattle rustlers. Samuel was a fair man, respected in the nearby settlement of Tombstone, though some whispered he was too trusting of the Apache who occasionally passed through his land seeking water. That evening, Elena sat on the wooden steps of their modest ranch house watching the sun sink behind the jagged peaks. The cattle lowed softly in the distance, a comforting sound she'd known all her life. Her father sat beside her, his weathered face creased with worry lines that seemed deeper lately. "Pa, you've been awful quiet today," Elena said, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "Something troubling you?" Samuel's gray eyes scanned the darkening landscape. "Been hearing talk in town about new trouble brewing. Word is there's a gang of raiders moving through the territory. Not Apache, but white men dressed like them, stirring up fear and taking what they please." Elena felt a chill despite the evening warmth. "You think they'd come this far out?" "Hard to say, daughter. But I want you staying close to the house for a while. Promise me that." Before Elena could respond, the sound of hoofbeats thundered across the valley floor. Both father and daughter stood, Samuel's hand instinctively moving to the rifle leaning against the porch rail. In the fading light, they could see 6 riders approaching fast, their faces obscured by bandanas and shadows. "Elena, get inside. Now." Samuel's voice carried the authority of a man who'd faced danger before, but there was no time. The riders burst into the yard like a storm, whooping and firing shots into the air. Their horses kicked up clouds of dust that stung Elena's eyes and filled her lungs. Through the chaos, she could see these weren't Apache warriors. They were white men with cruel eyes and predatory grins, their clothing a mixture of stolen Apache gear and ragged frontier wear. "Well, well," called out the leader, a tall man with a scar running from his left ear to the corner of his mouth. "Samuel Mackenzie, the Apache-loving rancher. We've come to collect what you owe." "I don't owe you men anything," Samuel replied, his rifle now raised. "State your business or ride on." The scarred man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Your business is our business now, old man, and that pretty daughter of yours is exactly what we came for." Elena's blood turned to ice. She tried to back toward the door, but 2 riders had already circled behind the house. Samuel fired once, dropping one of the men from his saddle, but the others were on them before he could reload. "Pa!" Elena screamed as a raider struck her father with the butt of a rifle, sending him crashing to the ground. Rough hands seized her arms, and despite her struggles, she found herself being dragged toward a waiting horse. The scarred leader leaned down from his saddle, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Your daddy's been too friendly with the Apache girl. Time you learned what happens to families who forget which side they're on. Let her go." Samuel struggled to his feet, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "Take what you want from the ranch, but leave my daughter be." "Oh, we'll be back for the ranch too," the leader sneered. "But first, this little dove needs to learn some respect. Boys, tie her up good. We've got a long ride ahead." Elena fought with every ounce of strength she possessed, kicking and clawing at her captors. But there were too many of them. They bound her wrists with rough rope that cut into her skin and threw her across a horse like a sack of grain. As they rode away from the only home she'd ever known, Elena caught one last glimpse of her father kneeling in the dirt, clutching his bleeding head and shouting her name into the darkening sky. The raiders rode hard through the night, following game trails that wound through rocky canyons and dense stands of mesquite. Elena's body ached from being bounced against the horse's flank, and her throat was raw from breathing dust. The men said little during the ride, but their occasional laughter and crude comments made her stomach turn with fear. As dawn broke over, the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. The raiders finally stopped to rest near a hidden spring Elena had never seen before. The scarred leader, who the others called Briggs, pulled her from the horse and let her collapse to the ground. "Welcome to your new home, sweetheart," Briggs said, gesturing toward a crude camp hidden among the rocks. "Hope you're ready to earn your keep." Elena's eyes darted around the camp, taking in the stolen goods piled near the fire, the Apache weapons, and clothing mixed with items she recognized from other ranches in the area. These men weren't just raiders. They were parasites feeding off the conflict between settlers and Apache to further their own criminal enterprises. "My father will come for me," Elena said, trying to keep her voice steady. "And when he does—" Briggs backhanded her across the face, the blow sending her sprawling. "Your daddy ain't coming for nobody, girl. By now the whole territory thinks Apache raiders took you. And even if he did come looking, he'd never find this place." As Elena tasted blood on her lips, she realized the full horror of her situation. These men had planned everything carefully. The Apache disguises, the remote location, even the timing of the attack. No one would think to look for white raiders in a place like this. But as the morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows, across the rocky landscape, Elena noticed something the raiders had missed. There, pressed into the soft earth near the spring, was the print of an unshod horse, and beside it the distinctive moccasin track of an Apache warrior. Someone else knew about this place. Someone was watching. 3 days had passed since Elena's capture, and each hour brought fresh humiliation and terror. The raiders took turns guarding her, their eyes following her every movement with predatory hunger. Briggs had made it clear that she was being saved for something special, a fate that made her blood run cold whenever she thought about it. The hidden camp lay in a natural bowl surrounded by towering sandstone formations that glowed red in the morning light. A narrow canyon provided the only entrance, making it nearly impossible to approach without being seen. The raiders had chosen their stronghold well, Elena realized with growing despair. On the third evening, as shadows began to lengthen across the desert floor, Elena sat near the dying campfire with her hands bound behind her back. The rope had rubbed her wrists raw, and her dress was torn and stained with dust and dried blood from where Briggs had struck her. 2 raiders dozed nearby while a third kept watch at the canyon entrance. It was then that Elena first saw him, a figure moving like a ghost among the rocks above the camp. At first she thought it might be a trick of the fading light, but when she looked again, she caught a glimpse of a man crouched behind a boulder, his dark eyes studying the camp below. Elena's heart raced. Could it be her father? Had he somehow tracked her to this remote place? But as the figure shifted slightly, she realized this was no white settler. The man wore traditional Apache clothing, buckskin leggings and a cotton shirt, with long black hair tied back with a red band. Even from a distance, she could see the dark stain on his shirt that spoke of a wound still bleeding. The Apache warrior, for that's surely what he was, remained motionless for long minutes, clearly assessing the situation. Elena found herself holding her breath, afraid that even the slightest movement might give away his position. When one of the sleeping raiders stirred, she forced herself to look away, not wanting to draw attention to the rocks above. As full darkness fell, the camp settled into an uneasy quiet. The guard at the canyon entrance had been replaced by a younger raider who seemed more interested in the bottle of whiskey he'd brought along than in watching for intruders. Elena lay on her side near the cold ashes of the fire, pretending to sleep while her mind raced with desperate hope. A sound like the whisper of wind through dry grass made her open her eyes. The Apache warrior crouched beside her in the darkness, so close she could see the pain etched in his weathered features. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 30 years, with intelligent dark eyes and a face marked by both hardship and determination. The wound in his side had soaked his shirt with blood, but his hands were steady as he produced a knife from his belt. "Do not move," he whispered in accented but clear English. "Do not make sound." Elena nodded fractionally, her heart hammering as the warrior cut through her bonds with careful precision. The relief of having her hands free after 3 days was almost overwhelming, but she remained perfectly still as the man helped her sit up. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "I think so," Elena whispered back. The warrior glanced toward the sleeping raiders, then back at Elena. "My name is Joseph. Joseph Crowfeather. Your father, he is good man. He has helped my people." Elena's eyes widened in recognition. Her father had mentioned Joseph several times, an Apache scout who had served with the U.S. Army before being falsely accused of leading raids against white settlements. He'd been forced to flee into the wilderness, branded as a renegade despite his years of service. "These men who took you," Joseph continued, his jaw tightening with anger, "they wear clothes of my people to hide their crimes. They bring shame on all Apache." Before Elena could respond, the drunken guard at the canyon entrance suddenly stood up, swaying as he peered into the darkness. "Hey, who's there?" Joseph moved with lightning speed, pressing Elena down behind a pile of stolen goods as the guard stumbled toward the camp. But the raider's shout had awakened the others, and within seconds the camp erupted in confusion. "Where's the girl?" Briggs roared, his scar standing out white against his fury-darkened face. "She was right here," one of the men protested. "I swear she was tied up tight." Joseph materialized from the shadows like an avenging spirit, his knife flashing as he struck down the nearest raider before the man could draw his gun. But there were too many of them, and in his wounded condition, the Apache warrior couldn't fight them all. "There!" shouted another raider, pointing at Elena's hiding place. "Behind the supplies!" Elena broke cover and ran, but her legs, weakened by 3 days of captivity, gave out after only a few steps. She fell hard, scraping her hands and knees on the rocky ground as bullets whistled over her head. Joseph appeared beside her again, hauling her to her feet with one powerful arm, while his other hand returned fire with a rifle he'd taken from the first raider. "The horses!" he shouted over the gunfire. "Can you ride?" Elena nodded, adrenaline overcoming her exhaustion. Together, they ran toward the string of horses picketed at the far edge of the camp. Joseph lifted her onto the back of a sturdy paint horse, then swung up behind her just as Briggs and his remaining men reached them. "You're not taking her anywhere, Apache," Briggs snarled, raising his rifle. Joseph spurred the horse forward just as Briggs fired. The bullet meant for Elena's rescuer struck him in the shoulder instead, spinning him sideways but not unseating him. With Elena pressed against his chest, Joseph guided their mount toward the narrow canyon entrance, the other horses scattering in panic as the raiders continued shooting. They thundered through the canyon in near total darkness, the horses' hooves echoing off the stone walls like gunshots. Behind them, Elena could hear Briggs screaming orders to his men, organizing a pursuit that would surely follow within minutes. "Where are we going?" Elena called over the wind rushing past her ears. "Safe place," Joseph replied through gritted teeth. She could feel the warmth of his blood soaking through his shirt where the bullet had found its mark. "Place where where he helped my people before." As they emerged from the canyon into the open desert, Elena looked back to see torches being lit in the raiders' camp. Soon those lights would be moving, following their trail across the moonlit landscape. But for now, for the first time in 3 days, she was free. And riding beside her was a wounded warrior who had risked everything to save a stranger, a man whose very presence in this territory marked him for death, yet who had chosen to protect her anyway. Elena didn't understand why Joseph Crowfeather had come for her, but she was grateful beyond words. The desert stretched endlessly before them, silver under the stars, full of both promise and peril. Somewhere out there lay sanctuary, if they could reach it before Briggs and his raiders caught up with them. The hidden spring lay nestled in a grove of ancient cottonwoods, their leaves rustling like whispered prayers in the pre-dawn breeze. Joseph had guided them there through a maze of arroyos and rocky outcroppings, following paths invisible to Elena's untrained eyes. By the time they reached the sanctuary, both horse and riders were exhausted, and Joseph's wounds had left him pale and unsteady in the saddle. Elena helped him down from the paint horse, supporting his weight as he stumbled toward the clear water bubbling up from the rocks. In the growing light, she could see the full extent of his injuries, the older wound in his side that had been bleeding for days, and the fresh bullet hole in his shoulder from Briggs's parting shot. You need tending, Elena said, kneeling beside him as he slumped against a fallen log. Those wounds could fester. Joseph nodded weakly. There is medicine, plants that grow here. Your father, he brought supplies once, hidden in the rocks. Elena looked around the peaceful grove, trying to reconcile it with her father's cautious nature. Samuel Mackenzie was a practical man who avoided unnecessary risks. What had brought him to this remote place, and why had he helped an Apache warrior, branded as a renegade? Following Joseph's directions, Elena found the cache hidden beneath a carefully arranged pile of stones. Inside a waterproof oilcloth were medical supplies, ammunition, and dried food, enough to sustain a wounded man for weeks. There was also something else, a letter written in her father's careful script. Joseph, the letter read, I pray you, never have need of these supplies, but if you're reading this, then the worst has happened and they've found your trail. You saved my brother's life at Apache Pass, and I'll not forget that debt. This spring has been a refuge for your people. For generations, may it serve you well. The truth about those raids will come out eventually. Until then, stay safe. Samuel Mackenzie. Elena stared at the letter, pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed suddenly falling into place. You saved my uncle's life? Joseph managed a weak smile as she began cleaning his wounds with water and cloth from the cache. David Mackenzie, good soldier. We served together, scouting for General Crook. When renegades attacked our patrol, he was wounded. I carried him 10 miles to safety. But the army accused you of leading those raids, Elena said, remembering the stories that had circulated through Tombstone. They said you turned against your own kind. Joseph's face hardened. White men in Apache clothes, same men who took you. I tried to tell Army the truth, but who believes Apache over white settlers? He winced as Elena applied a poultice made from willow bark and desert sage. So I became Ghost, living in shadows, protecting what I can. Elena worked in thoughtful silence, her respect for this wounded warrior growing with each revelation. She'd grown up hearing stories of savage Apache raiders, but Joseph Crowfeather was nothing like those tales. He was educated, honorable, and willing to risk his life for people who would never accept him. Why did you come for me? She asked finally. Joseph met her eyes with a gaze that held depths of sadness and resolve. Your father is good man. When I heard white raiders took his daughter, I knew they would blame my people. More innocent Apache would die for their crimes. He paused, his voice growing softer. Also, no woman should suffer what those men planned for you. Elena felt heat rise in her cheeks, but not from embarrassment. This man, this stranger who owed her nothing, had risked everything to save her honor and her life. The contrast between his nobility and the brutality of her captors was stark and humbling. As the sun climbed higher, painting the grove in dappled gold, Elena heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. Joseph's hand moved instinctively to his rifle. Despite his weakness, they found our trail, he said grimly. Elena climbed onto a boulder and peered through the leaves. In the distance, she could see a dust cloud approaching, too large to be Briggs and his remaining raiders alone. Her heart sank as she recognized the blue uniforms mixed in with the civilian clothes. It's a cavalry patrol, she called down to Joseph. They're with the raiders. Joseph closed his eyes in resignation. Briggs, he is clever. He tells them Apache took you, that he was tracking to help. Now he has army to hunt us both. Elena climbed down, her mind racing. There has to be something we can do, some way to prove the truth. In my saddlebags, Joseph said weakly. There are papers, letters from army officers who knew the truth about me. And something else, proof of what Briggs and his men have been doing. Elena rifled through the leather bags, finding the documents Joseph had mentioned. Among them was a detailed journal describing the raiders' activities with dates, locations, and even sketches of the stolen goods in their camp. More importantly, there were sworn statements from 2 settlers who had witnessed the false flag attacks. This could clear your name, Elena breathed. If anyone would listen to Apache and Stolen Woman, Joseph replied bitterly. The hoofbeats were getting closer. Elena could hear voices now. Briggs calling out orders, soldiers responding with military precision. They had perhaps 10 minutes before the grove would be surrounded. "Joseph," Elena said, taking his hand in hers. "You've given me everything. Let me give you something in return." Before he could protest, Elena tore a strip from her petticoat and fashioned it into a white flag. Then she walked to the edge of the grove, where she would be visible to the approaching patrol. "Elena Mackenzie!" Briggs's voice carried across the desert like the crack of a whip. "Come out now, girl, and we might let that Apache dog die quick." Elena stepped into the open, her hands raised but holding the evidence that could change everything. Behind her, she heard Joseph struggling to his feet, determined to face whatever came with dignity and tact. "I'm here," Elena called out. "And I have something to show you, something that proves who the real criminals are." The patrol spread out in a wide circle, their weapons trained on the grove. In the center rode a young cavalry lieutenant Elena didn't recognize, his face hard with suspicion. Beside him, Briggs sat his horse with the confident smirk of a man who believed he held all the cards. "That's her, Lieutenant," Briggs said loudly enough for everyone to hear. "Poor girl's been through hell at the hands of that renegade. Probably don't even know what she's saying anymore." Elena felt Joseph move up beside her, his presence giving her strength despite his wounds. Together they faced the circle of armed men, their only weapons being truth and courage. "Lieutenant," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the tense silence. "I am Elena Mackenzie, daughter of Samuel Mackenzie of the Box M Ranch. I was taken by these raiders 3 nights ago, not by Apache, but by white men wearing stolen Apache clothes to hide their crimes." "Don't listen to her," Briggs snarled. "She's been turned by that savage." But Elena continued, pulling out the journal and letters. "I have proof right here. Evidence of every raid these men have committed, every life they've destroyed while blaming innocent Apache for their crimes." The lieutenant's eyes narrowed as he studied the papers Elena held out. Behind him, several of the soldiers were beginning to look uncertain, glancing between Briggs and the determined young woman who stood fearlessly before them. The moment of truth had arrived. Everything, Joseph's life, Elena's honor, and the safety of innocent Apache throughout the territory, hung in the balance of what happened next. Lieutenant Thomas Morrison had served on the frontier long enough to recognize truth when he heard it, even when that truth challenged everything he'd been told. As he examined the documents Elena had presented, his weathered face grew increasingly grim. The journal entries detailing the false flag raids, the sworn statements from witnesses, and most damning of all, a letter from Briggs himself planning the frame-up of Joseph Crow Feather. It was all there in black and white. "These are serious accusations, Miss Mackenzie," Morrison said, his gray eyes studying first Elena, then Joseph, and finally settling on Briggs with unmistakable suspicion. Briggs shifted nervously in his saddle, his scarred face flushing red with anger. "Come now, Lieutenant. You can't believe the word of some half-crazy girl and a renegade Apache over honest settlers who've been fighting these savages for years." "Honest?" Elena's voice rang with righteous fury. "You dragged me from my father's ranch in the middle of the night. You and your men terrorized me for 3 days planning God knows what horrors." She pointed directly at Briggs, her finger trembling with emotion. "This man is no settler. He's a criminal who's been using Apache clothing to hide his raids while real Apache take the blame." Joseph stepped forward despite his wounds, his voice steady and clear. "Lieutenant Morrison, I served under Colonel Crook for 2 years as a scout. I have never raised my hand against innocent people. These men wear my people's clothes to hide their shame, but their crimes stain all Apache." Morrison studied the wounded warrior with growing respect. Despite being outnumbered 20-1 and bleeding from multiple wounds, Joseph Crow Feather stood with the dignity of a man who had nothing to hide. The contrast with Briggs, who was sweating profusely despite the cool morning air, was telling. "Sergeant Fletcher," Morrison called to his second-in-command. "Secure Mr. Briggs and his men for questioning." "Now hold on just a minute." Briggs exploded, his hand moving toward his gun. "You can't take the word of these." The sound of multiple rifles being cocked cut off his protest. Morrison's men, experienced frontier soldiers all, had read their lieutenant's mood correctly. Whatever doubts they might have harbored about Apache intentions, they trusted their officer's judgment implicitly. "Slowly, Mr. Briggs," Morrison said, calmly. "Hands where we can see them." For a moment, Elena thought the confrontation might end peacefully. Then Briggs's eyes met hers across the circle, and she saw madness there, the desperate fury of a cornered animal with nothing left to lose. "You've ruined everything," Briggs screamed, drawing his pistol with lightning speed. "If I can't have you, nobody can." Time seemed to slow as Briggs raised his weapon toward Elena. She stood frozen, unable to move, watching death approach in the form of a black barrel pointed directly at her heart. Around the circle, soldiers were shouting and raising their own weapons. But they were too far away, their reaction time too slow. Joseph Crow Feather moved like thunder given human form. Despite his wounds, despite the weakness from blood loss, the Apache warrior threw himself between Elena and Briggs's gun just as the raider pulled the trigger. The bullet, meant for Elena's heart, took Joseph full in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the dusty earth. The grove exploded in gunfire as Morrison's soldiers opened up on Briggs and his remaining men. The raiders, outnumbered and caught in the open, were cut down in seconds. Briggs himself, his scarred face twisted in a final snarl of hatred, died with his smoking gun still clutched in his hand. Elena fell to her knees beside Joseph, her hands pressing against the spreading crimson stain on his chest. His dark eyes found hers, and despite the pain etched in every line of his face, he managed a small smile. "Is good," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You are safe now. That is good." "Don't you dare," Elena said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "Don't you dare give up on me now, Joseph Crowfeather, not after everything we've been through." Lieutenant Morrison knelt on Joseph's other side, his medical training taking over. "Miss Mackenzie, help me get pressure on this wound. Sergeant Fletcher, send 2 men back to Fort Bowie for the surgeon. Ride like hell." As Elena pressed her hands against Joseph's chest, feeling his life flowing away beneath her palms, she found herself praying harder than she ever had in her life. This man, this brave, noble warrior who had risked everything to save a stranger, couldn't die now. Not when the truth had finally come to light. Not when there was still so much left unsaid between them. "Joseph," she whispered, leaning close to his ear. "You told me once that my father was a good man because he helped your people. Well, you helped me when no one else would. You protected me when the whole world seemed against us both. That makes you the best man I've ever known." Joseph's eyes flickered open at her words. "Elena, your father, tell him I kept the promise, kept you safe." "You tell him yourself," Elena insisted. "When you're better, when all this is over, you come to our ranch and you tell him yourself. There's a place for you there, Joseph. There's always been a place for you." Lieutenant Morrison worked frantically over Joseph's wounds, using supplies from Elena's father's cache and his own field. Medical kit. The bullet had missed Joseph's heart by inches, but it had done terrible damage to his lung. Still, the Apache warrior's constitution was strong, hardened by years of life in the harsh desert. As the sun climbed higher, painting the cottonwood, grove in shades of gold and green, Elena sat beside Joseph and told him stories of her father's ranch. She spoke of the cattle drives and the harvest seasons, of winter evenings by the fireplace and summer days when the desert bloomed with unexpected color. She painted pictures with words of a life where a man could be judged by his character, rather than the color of his skin or the circumstances of his birth. By the time the army surgeon arrived from Fort Bowie, Joseph's breathing had stabilized. The doctor, a gruff but competent man named Reynolds, worked for 2 hours extracting the bullet and cleaning the wound. When he finally sat back, wiping sweat from his brow, his expression was cautiously optimistic. "He's lost a lot of blood, but he's got the constitution of a horse," Reynolds announced. "With proper care and rest, I think he'll make it." Elena felt as though a crushing weight had been lifted from her chest. Around her, Lieutenant Morrison and his men were securing the evidence that would clear Joseph's name and expose the truth about the false flag raids. The nightmare that had begun 3 nights ago was finally coming to an end. But as Elena looked down at Joseph's still form, she realized that something else was beginning, something she hadn't expected and couldn't quite name. This wounded warrior had shown her what true courage looked like, what it meant to stand up for what was right regardless of the personal cost. He had protected her not because he had to, but because it was the right thing to do. In the days that followed, as Joseph slowly recovered and the truth about Briggs's criminal enterprise spread throughout the territory, Elena found herself looking forward to his visits to the ranch. Her father, true to his word, had offered Joseph a place among their hands, and the Apache warrior had accepted with quiet dignity. The townsfolk of Tombstone took longer to come around, but as stories of Joseph's heroism spread and the evidence against Briggs became undeniable, even the most prejudiced began to reconsider their assumptions. Joseph Crow Feather, the supposed renegade, became Joseph the Protector, the man who had risked everything to save an innocent woman from the very criminals who had been terrorizing the territory. And Elena? She had learned that sometimes salvation comes from the most unexpected sources, that courage often wears the face of an outsider, and that the human heart recognizes nobility regardless of the package it comes in. In the blazing heat of the Arizona desert, she had discovered truths about herself, about justice, and about the kind of man worthy of her respect, truths that would shape the rest of her life. The wounded warrior had indeed protected her with his life, but in doing so, he had given her something even more precious. The knowledge that in a world often divided by fear and hatred, there were still those willing to bridge the gap with acts of pure, selfless courage.